you. Thank you very much. Please be seated and welcome to the East Room of the White House. We are honored, the President and I, to have you join us for our first Millennium Evening. And I would like to thank everyone who has made this possible, especially Professor Balin, Ellen Lovell, our co-sponsor, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and all the state humanities councils who organized discussion groups tonight, the Howard Gilman Foundation, and particularly Sun Microsystems, who provided the technology to simultaneously bring this lecture to the world and preserve it for the ages. Right now, satellite feeds are allowing students and teachers and interested citizens to watch this event at 136 sites, 131 colleges, and 5 public television stations in 42 states. That information is then being immediately and digitally translated to the internet. This is the very first cybercast from the White House. As we speak, people surfing the internet anywhere in the world can hear or read our words, email us questions, and be part of history. I am thrilled that we're able to bring this to so many people throughout our country and indeed throughout the world. This Monday, we will celebrate the birthdays of 2 of our greatest presidents. The portrait of one of them, George Washington, hangs behind me. As I often point out, the only reason it is still here is because one of my predecessors, Dolly Madison, saved it. When she had word that the British were approaching in 1814, she had little time to flee, but she still managed to take Gilbert Stuart's famous painting. She knew that this portrait, like other treasures from our past, is part of our common history as Americans. Despite our differences, it is this common ground, these shared values, that must continue to bring us together. And despite the dramatic transformations taking place, it is this American story that we must continue to rethink and retell for every generation. As we approach the millennium, we have a wonderful opportunity to do just that. Not just to have a celebration about a time in history, but a conversation and a collaboration among Americans to take stock of who we are and who we want to be, starting with who we were. That's the goal of the White House Millennium effort that the President announced in August, to inspire all Americans, in the words of our theme, to honor the past and imagine the future. In the year 2000, we will also celebrate the 200th anniversary of the White House. And this is the first of many Millennium Evenings we will host through the year 2000. We will be inviting scholars, creators, visionaries, and others to help us look both backwards and forwards. In fact, on March 6th, the renowned physicist Stephen Hawking will lecture on creativity and science in the 21st century, thereby bringing us from the American Revolution to the universe in only 1 month. For more than 200 years, America has been not just a place, but an idea. And few scholars have so brilliantly explored how citizens created this enduring democratic ideal as Professor Bernard Balin. He began teaching at Harvard University in 1949 and is now the Adams University Professor Emeritus. For half a century, his creative exploration of the early American experience has earned him 2 Pulitzer Prizes, a National Book Award, and a Bancroft Prize, as well as the gratitude of many, many students and citizens. On March 23rd, he will deliver the National Endowment for the Humanities Jefferson Lecture, the highest honor in the humanities bestowed by the federal government. Not content to look at our history through a narrow prism, Professor Balin's boundless curiosity and energy have allowed him to explore the economic, intellectual, and social dimensions of our nation's story. He's looked at political pamphlets floating around our country in colonial times to tell the story of the ideological origins of the American Revolution. He's examined immigration patterns in the late 18th century to tell the story of the everyday people who came here and the hopes and dreams they brought to our shores. And more recently, he's looked at the way 18th century America interacted with neighboring regions to tell the story about our enduring connection to others around the world. Perhaps his greatest gift, and the one he will share with us tonight, is his ability as a teacher and scholar to take our greatest lessons from the past and make them relevant today. It is such a great pleasure to have him inaugurate these Millennium Evenings. As he has said, whether we recognize it or not, the sense that we make of the history of our national origins helps to define for us the values, purposes, and acceptable characteristics of our public institutions. It is now my great honor to introduce Professor Bernard Bailyn.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Clinton. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, Mrs. Gore, ladies and gentlemen, it is, of course, an enormous honor and privilege to inaugurate this series of Millennium Lectures, part of the broad and extraordinarily imaginative program of Millennium events that have been planned. But I have to say, inaugurating a lecture series can be a rather risky business. I remember the miserable fate of one of your predecessors, Mr. President, John Quincy Adams, who, while senator from Massachusetts, inaugurated Harvard's Boylston Lectures on Rhetoric and Oratory, a series, I should say, that despite Adams has survived and continues to this day. The future president feared that when published, his effort would be, in his words, handled without mercy by critics on both sides of the Atlantic. He need not have worried about the British. They ignored his performance completely. But he was right about the critics on this side, one of whom said that what Adams wrote was no doubt admirable, but unfortunately, it lacked a few particulars, namely, quote, truth and precision of expression. And it also lacked grace and propriety in the use of words. Nor did Adams' production improve with age. 75 years later, the literary critic Thomas Wentworth Higginson wrote that anybody who managed to read the thing through would find, quote, a record of repetition, of verbiage, surprising you by the number of words that it takes him to say a simple thing. Now, one must learn from history. And so, avoiding your predecessor's blunders, Mr. President, I will be brief, and I go straight to the point, which is that in our public life, we Americans, though we are often described as a young nation with a shallow history, in fact live remarkably close to the past. And I mean the deeper past, reaching back 400 years to the first settlement of Europeans on mainland North America, and 200 years to the founding of the nation. 200 years ago, John Adams was president. He was the first to live in this house. And the events of his lifetime have, I believe, an extraordinary relevance to our lives as we approach the 21st century. But it is remarkable that that should be so. When Adams was president, transportation and communication were essentially the same as they had been at the time of the first millennium. Washington, D.C. was a rustic wasteland, a muddy, disease-ridden collection of rubbish heaps, tree stumps, bogs, marshes, and rows of bleak wooden houses hastily thrown together. Hogs rooted in the refuse and wandered around the one unfinished hotel. The carriages of diplomats in full regalia got stuck axle deep in mud, and the Secretary of State recorded success in trapping a 2-foot snake at the foot of his staircase. Now, of course, there were plans for splendid urban vistas and monumental buildings, but of the latter, the only two in evidence when Adams was president were the half-built Capitol and the White House. All there was of the Capitol were the flimsily built Senate and House buildings with nothing in between except a boardwalk. The House chamber had a glass dome ceiling that leaked, but this was better than the Senate's ceiling, which collapsed in a heap, just missing the vice president's chair. And as for the White House, when the Adamses moved in, Abigail Adams, by the way, got lost in the Maryland woods trying to find the place. Only 5 of the 30 rooms had plastered walls. There were no stairs to the second floor, and the only place she could find to hang out the family washing was what she called the great unfinished audience room, which is, I believe, the room we are in now. What has this sad clutter of workmen's shanties, tree stumps, privies, stagnant pools, and muddy cow paths to do with us? More important, how can we possibly relate to a pre-industrial world whose social and economic problems were utterly different from ours and whose social policies, insofar as they had any, if implemented, would now create chaos? They knew about special interests and about social and political fanaticisms. Their politics was as fiercely partisan as ours, at times even more vicious and remorseless. But they had no idea how powerfully public opinion in a modern democracy can be manipulated, especially by instruments of communication they couldn't have conceived of. Much of their thinking about politics in large republics was based on assumptions about geographical distance and its calming and dissipating effect on political passions. But we live at a time when distance is obliterated and scattered forces can coalesce by instantaneous communication with intensifying effect. The instruments of coercive force that they knew, that is, the machinery of physical and legal intimidation, were far weaker than ours, and the ways of escaping from the agencies of public power more numerous. Yet, despite these differences and more that separate us from our past, we remain remarkably close to it. We constantly invoke the views of historical figures, Jefferson, Madison, Lincoln, but not just ritualistically. They seem to be part of our present political discourse, as, say, the views of Pitt or Burke are not for the British, or Robespierre or Condorcet are not for the French. Our entire public life centers on an 18th century Constitution. And while it has been amended repeatedly and expanded and revised by judicial interpretation, it remains structurally what it was when it was written 200 years ago, an artful complex of bounded powers. Even the commentaries on the Constitution that were written in the far distant days of its controversial adoption seem to lie at the heart of our own current thought. There is no more remarkable telescoping of past and present than the continuing relevance of the Federalist Papers. These 85 essays were thrown together in great haste in the fierce struggle over ratification of the Constitution in New York. At the feverish height of the debate, when it seemed certain that New York would refuse to ratify the Constitution, the Federalist authors were frantically writing and publishing 1,000 words a day, copying helter-skelter from what they had written before, chopping up longer essays into smaller bits to meet newspaper publication deadlines, which came up at first twice a week and then at the end 4 times a week. That desperate struggle took place 210 years ago, yet we study every phrase of those essays for meanings relevant to our present public life. The Supreme Court refers to their authority repeatedly. 34 times, for example, between 1981 and 1985, in decisions that affect the lives of every American in the late 20th century. There is now a concordance of the Federalist Papers, something one associates with the Bible and the works of Shakespeare, in which every use of every word in the papers is listed out to enable readers to grasp every verbal nuance in what these 18th century politicians wrote in such haste and desperation. But it is not only the political and constitutional past that is close to us. We struggle with the residue of slavery and racism that appeared at the dawn of our history as a people, and the force of Puritanism and evangelical Protestantism, which appeared here 350 years ago, is still with us, despite the religious complexity of our own world. We are not really products of our history. Every nation is that. We are steeped in it, consciously or unconsciously, remarkably close to it in everyday life, and we draw from our history some understanding of the essentials, the essences of our public life as a nation and of what we carried forward into the future. We have had from the beginning, and have now, it is a profound legacy of our deepest past, a strange combination of a belief, a faith in government, and a fear of power. Both, in the earliest years, were woven together, intertwined into the fabric of our public life, and they have remained there ever since, a source of strength and protection and political controversy. The combination seems almost immemorial. Jefferson, despite his deep involvements in everything under the sun, farming, technology, science, scholarship, architecture, trade, served in state and national governments for 33 years. He wrote a constitution for his own state of Virginia and a manual of parliamentary practice. He worried over every word of the federal constitution when it appeared, and he advised the French revolutionaries on the exact terms of governmental reform that would serve that nation best. In his tour of Europe, he wrote vividly of what a difference government makes in people's lives. What lay at the heart of Europe's miseries, he wrote, are vices in the form of government. It is difficult to conceive, he wrote of the French, how so good a people, with so good a king, so well-disposed rulers in general, so genial a climate, so fertile a soil, should be rendered so ineffectual for producing human happiness by one single curse, that of a bad form of government. But it is a fact. He and his leading contemporaries struggled to find the right form of government and devoted their lives to serving in government, convinced that government is a powerful force for good, a creative force that would provide for justice, secure peace and good order, stimulate the society's enterprise in agriculture, commerce, and industry, and encourage learning, technology, and the arts. The Constitution that John Adams wrote for Massachusetts was submitted to all of the state's small towns and villages for ratification. 2/3 of them, 181 communities, some mere hamlets, responded with comments. Small groups of farmers meeting in churches, parlors, barns, backwoods crossroads, argued about technical clauses in the Constitution and sent on their conclusions to Boston, convinced that their welfare depended on the precise terms of the government that they were adopting and that it was their duty to participate. And yet, at the same time, they were convinced that power, which is the essence of government, could destroy them. For while they thought of government, self-government in proper form, as a necessary benevolent and creative force, and they knew perfectly well that government means power, they feared the uses and misuses of power. They wrote of their fear of power continuously, eloquently, and elaborately. They believed that the dangers of embedded power in anyone's hands, heroes or villains, were the same, and they struggled to express their fears. The writings of Adams's generation are crowded with metaphors, similes, and tropes of every kind to express their fear of the corruptions of established power. The love of power, they wrote again and again, its gleaming but corrosive satisfactions are rooted elementally in the human heart and will eventually corrupt every public institution unless people of goodwill and integrity resist, and unless the forces within government are so pitched against each other, so poised to confront each other, that excesses in the use of power are challenged and contained before they become insuperable. It was in response to their fear of power that they demanded the explicit protection of human rights, and they struggled for the first time in recorded history, not merely to state this in general terms, but to specify what these rights, all these rights, are. There is no more important passage in American history and in the history of the modern liberal state than the groping, fumbling efforts of Adams's generation to make the protection of rights effective in ordinary people's lives. The issue was felt to be necessary, but found to be extremely difficult even to understand. At first, in many of the state constitutions written immediately after independence, they simply stated the general abstract proposition that all inalienable rights should be preserved and protected. But when it came to particulars, to define what these rights were, they found themselves at sea. What precisely are the human rights? Some seemed obvious, many were not, and turned out to be whatever happened to occur to the authors of these constitutions when they happened to be writing them. The newly written states' constitutions contain 85 inalienable rights, and some of them seem rather strange. In Pennsylvania, for example, one apparently God-given human right was the right to hunt on unclaimed land. A consensus did develop on a certain core of procedural and substantive rights, but there were no clear boundaries and definitions differed. When the federal Constitution was written, the wisest minds in America decided that there should be no national Bill of Rights, not merely because most of the state constitutions already contained some such protections, but as Madison, who would later write the Federal Bill of Rights, said, there is a great reason to fear that a positive declaration of some of the most essential rights could not be obtained in the requisite latitude. In other words, the enumeration of rights by the federal government, the mere listing of them and defining them, would necessarily limit their scope. The rights of conscience in particular, Madison said, if submitted to public definition, would be narrowed more than they are ever likely to be by an assumed power. The right solution, he and others then felt, was what is implied in the present Ninth Amendment, that there is a universe of rights possessed by the people, some defined and protected by the states, some latent, still to be evoked and enacted into law. But was this workable? In any given situation, someone would have to decide whether the rights that were claimed were valid, and that would leave the existence of rights to the mercy of personal and political opinion. The result is the compromise that we have inherited from them, and that we live with and struggle with and benefit from every day of our lives, namely a carefully worded list of specific federal rights in the first 8 amendments, together with the belief that there are not only rights protected by the states, but a reservoir of other rights that the people retain, which in time, through the judicial process, may be enacted into law. They were not anticipating our struggles over judicial activism. They were thinking more broadly. They were saying that the world changes, that rights, like law itself, should never be fixed, frozen, that new dangers and new needs will emerge, and that to respond to these dangers and needs, rights must be newly specified to protect the individual's integrity and inherent dignity. So despite the differences that separate our world from the 18th century, we are contemporaries of Adams in venerating government but fearing power, and in protecting rights that can never be finally defined or limited in number. But we are contemporaries of our deeper past in a more complex and I think a more profound way. John Adams, after his tumultuous presidency, retired to Quincy, Massachusetts, where, amidst his books, family, and friends, he spent the last 25 years contemplating the accomplishments and failures of his own public life and the life of his remarkable generation. The town of Quincy was a tranquil, civilized, provincial community, but it was part of a larger world that was violent and half-developed, a world that had known brutality and savage inequalities from its earliest years. The barbarousness of relations between the settling Europeans and the native peoples at the start of Euro-American life is agonizing to recall. It is hard, even for us who are familiar with genocide, to believe. In the earliest years, the English and Dutch sent over to America what contemporaries quite accurately called hammerers, well-equipped, battle-tested shock troops from the Low Countries wars to deal with the Indians, who, deprived of their lands and fearful that their entire way of life would be destroyed, had attacked the European communities again and again, at times with merciless fury, hoping to obliterate the encroaching force. In fierce encounters that involved butchery of men, women, and children, incineration of entire inhabited villages, and indiscriminate destruction of crops and animals, the coastal natives were defeated, killed or displaced, their culture shattered, their remnants fleeing to other more remote groups to form quite strange motley communities deeper inland. But at the same time, the labor force was supplemented in some places entirely supplied by Africans, whose condition of servitude within a single generation reached the point of absolute debasement. When Adams assumed the presidency, the native population, which had been further brutalized in the Revolutionary War, had been driven back across the Appalachians in places confined to reservations, and 20% of the entire American population was enslaved. And Adams's world was otherwise, a mixed population of different statuses, privileges, and powers. A third of Pennsylvania's population were Germans, some naturalized with full political power, privileges, some not. And they were of several religious confessions, some legally recognized, some not. New York's population was derived from a mixture of English, Dutch, Walloons, Germans, Scandinavians, and French, ethnic, multilinguistic, half civil, half barbarous society whose social and political relations were dominated by severe inequalities that encountered, in the founding years of the Republic, the benign and universalist principles of the Enlightenment and of Anglo-American radical reform. The United States has lived, and we live now, with the results of that encounter. The great goals of Enlightenment reform in America were set out most vividly by Jefferson. He was, let it be said, a fallible man, and he was a pragmatic, opportunistic politician who feared power in others, but used it deftly himself. But he was also the revolution's true poet, its deepest conscience and its most brilliant expositor. His was the most eloquent voice of America's revolutionary ideology as he proclaimed, in the face of these brutal realities, the principles of equality before the law, of absolute freedom of conscience, of responsible self-government, of the need for universal diffusion of knowledge and access to education, and for freedom from poverty and the fear of poverty. It was a strange encounter. The distance between these glittering ideals and the sordid realities of Jefferson's world was vast. Slavery brutalized new thousands every year and poisoned the moral foundation of the nation as the Enlightenment ideals took root. On the frontiers, the barbarous, almost genocidal race wars continued. In the new republic, religious fanaticism led to deadly riots against peaceful dissidents. Poverty increased in the cities as the first post-revolutionary waves of immigrants appeared, creating new kinds of ethnic discrimination and a new population of illiterates. Exploited immigrant workmen became riotous. Troops were assembled to subdue them. And emancipation, when it came, was followed by savage race violence, while less lethal inhumanity dominated the lives of the laboring poor. How were these miseries to be reconciled with the revolution's soaring aspirations? Most of the new nation's leaders were social conservatives and realists, and they had not designed a social revolution. But the nation was committed to the ideals of enlightened reform and could not escape their pressure. Gradually, ambiguously, the force of these beliefs began to impinge on the sordid reality. In Adams's last years, slavery still existed, but the slave trade was gone. Slavery was abolished in the Old Northwest and was gradually being eliminated in the Northeast. Beyond that, the institution of slavery, which had rarely been seen as a problem before the Revolution, had become the overwhelming problem of American life. Illiteracy had increased, but while only 9 colleges had been chartered before the Revolution, 500 were created between then and the Civil War, and along with them, innumerable academies and community schools. Religious intolerance had lost the force of law. Church establishments had been abolished, and Jefferson's great Statute of Religious Freedom, which had been enacted only after a decade of bitter controversy, had become the standard by which success in establishing freedom of conscience could be measured. When Jefferson and Adams died, both on the 4th of July, 50 years after independence, none of the goals of the American Enlightenment, of the Revolution's transforming radicalism, had been reached. But a basic force had been created in American life: the propulsion within a pluralistic, tumultuous, abrasive, and ruthlessly ambitious society to approach the fulfillment of historic ideals. The gap between the real and the ideal remains, far narrower than in Adams's and Jefferson's time, but still achingly wide. We are still a multi-ethnic, materialistic, ambitious, impatient, and volatile people. But in our finest moments, we are also, I believe, the most idealistic nation on earth. We are riven by differences, discrimination, and animosities, but instinctively responding to ideals set out in our deeper past, we reach for reconciliation. A spark was struck 2 centuries ago, which lights the way for us still. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Balin, for that wonderful, wonderful lecture. I thank the First Lady and Ellen Lovell for conceiving this entire Millennium series. The others will have a hard act to follow. I can't think of a better way to inaugurate this series of lectures than with one on the founding of our republic, also the first White House cyberspace lecture. We are truly honoring the past not by imagining the future, but through the prism of the future. I thank Bernard Balin for what he said and the way he said it, and for a lifetime of work. We received the distilled wisdom tonight of more than 4 decades of hard thinking and work about what it means to be an American and what America means to Americans and to the rest of the world. I was rather amused. He said, you know, when we started, we had all these people who came from a lot of different places. They moved around a lot. They disagreed a lot. They were disdainful of government. So I thought, what's new? But they were also, as Professor Balin said at the end of his remarks, at their best moments, profoundly idealistic and always, always appropriately suspicious of untrammeled power in the hands of anyone in the government. They were very wise about human nature, our founders. They understood that there was light and dark in human nature. They understood that we are all imperfect, but society is nonetheless improvable. And in some ways, I think their most important charge to us was to always be about the business of forming a more perfect union. As I said in my State of the Union address, they understood it would never be perfect, but that we always had to try to make it more perfect. And that is what they always tried to do. And when they left the scene, they instructed us to follow suit. And we've been at it ever since. We have a lot of questions that we have to face about the new millennium. We're more diverse than ever before. Can we really be one America? How do we have a government that is flexible enough and strong enough to give people the tools they need to make the most of their own lives and still avoid the abuses that the founders understood would always be there when people were too driven by power instead of the larger purposes of America? How can we widen the circle of opportunity to include everyone in a market system that seems inherently exclusive in some ways? There are lots of other challenges facing us, but I think our ability to meet the challenges of the 21st century rests in no small measure on our understanding of the constant values and insights with which we began. By honoring the past, we know there were forebears there who were always imagining the future. By imagining the future, we must do so with the hope that all of our successors will honor our past. For it is there in the depth of our values and the genius of our system that we began the long journey that has brought us to this day, and that I am convinced will take us to better days ahead. Thank you again, Professor Balin. And now I'd like to turn the discussion over to the Director of the White House Millennium Council, Ellen Lovell, and we will begin with the questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to start our discussion by asking you to pose brief questions to Professor Balin so we can hear from as many of you as possible, including those who are with us tonight on the internet. And I hope you've been inspired, as I have. There are many well-known historians, among other distinguished guests in the room tonight, but I really thought that the first question to Professor Balin should go from one of his former students. Mr. Vice President?
Thank you very much, Ellen, and I would, on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank you and the rest of the First Lady's staff for implementing this wonderful vision, and you've set the bar pretty high, Professor. I brought the book you assigned 32 years ago, and I'd like to get your signature on it afterwards. But I do have a second question. I was struck by by the reference you made to the assumptions our founders made about distances and the physical reality of the new republic and how those distances could contain and dissipate passions. And you seemed to raise a warning flag about the new communications technologies, and of course here we have this historic cybercast going on, and you share the stage in effect with one of the new technologies. You seem to raise a flag that these technologies have a brand new capacity to quickly generate concentrations of power, to mobilize people, and you seem to say don't worry about that too much, because given the fact that we live and breathe the values that were put into our Constitution, we've always been able to contain those kinds of pressures. But even then, in those days, our founders warned us of the several vulnerabilities. The President talked about their understanding of human nature, and they talked about the dangers of faction as one special vulnerability. Madison was particularly eloquent, and I'm wondering whether or not you worry that, as some of my former colleagues in the House and Senate worry about these 30-second television commercials and internet communities that sometimes develop a sort of a separate reality from the common assumption base that the political dialogue is mostly based on. A lot of people in the Congress really worry that this power, coupled with a lot of money, can develop in a way that really should make us pay more attention to the warning flag that you put up and then kind of took part way down. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's true that Madison and others were very worried about the factions that would tear this country apart. That how the great republic, which had so many factions and had so many interests that would multiply as the nation grew, how you could contain it in some kind of a useful consensus, given all the aberrations and conflicts that would come up. And part of their answer was that the bigger the republic, the more likely it is that it would dissipate the effect of these factions. And if I can imagine what they would have thought about the way in which those factions now coalesce, which is what I mentioned, the way they immediately coalesce into more concentrated centers of influence and faction, I think they would have been very worried about this. This was not, their hope was that somehow you could moderate the conflicts and the factions within a free society like this. If you couldn't, it wouldn't be contained. And they were very concerned about this. As I say, part of their answer to this was simply that they lived in a physical universe where things would scatter and dissipate. That isn't true. And therefore, I think they would be very concerned about this now. How you counter it with the same kind of equipment, the same kind of processes that create it, is a problem we face. And it's more an answer in your line than mine.
Mrs. Clinton, we have a good question from Bismarck, North Dakota on the internet.
And the question does come from Bismarck, from someone named Everett. It seems to be in vogue these days to quote the founding fathers, especially Thomas Jefferson. How can people from conflicting political philosophies reference the same text? I think he's referring to the fact that you'll have liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans all quoting Jefferson, sometimes the very same words for different kinds of political ends.
Sometimes they don't agree. And there's a lot of division over interpreting some of these texts. But it depends who you're quoting and when. And in the case of Jefferson, it seems to me it's especially complicated, because while he was the great spokesman for so much of the principles that we publicly revere, he was himself a much more ambiguous person. And his own political career is rather complicated in this. But his statements of these principles, it seems to me, are easy to agree with. His behavior in some connections is less easy to agree with. But I think there will be divisions over interpreting these texts. I think that will continue to be the case.
I'd like to call on Professor Michael Kamen from Cornell University, another Pulitzer Prize winner and another Balin student.
You mentioned the importance.
Would you stand up, Professor Cameron? Thanks.
Okay.
You mentioned the importance to the founders, and especially James Madison, of somehow creating a Bill of Rights that would not define other rights out of existence. And you mentioned the importance to ordinary citizens at the time that there be these safeguards of their liberties. As you know, it took a very long time before the Federal Bill of Rights became deeply embedded in American constitutionalism, almost 130 years. Why do you think it took that long, and would James Madison and others among the founders have been dismayed that, or surprised, that it took so long for the Federal Bill of Rights to be extended in the way that it has been in the last 50 or 60 years?
It took such a long time for it to develop this way because the powers of the federal government until the Civil War period were quite restricted. It concerned the post office, and it concerned the customs service, and maintaining an army and a navy. But the social policies of the national government did not become effective until after the Civil War period. But as to the reaction to it, Madison felt, it's one of the most interesting parts of his career, felt that he was a failure on the one point that interested him most, namely in having the federal government control the vagaries of the state governments, which the Constitution does not do. So that later, when the 14th Amendment then allows the federal government to act upon the states in behalf of the stated rights, he would have been pleased. He fought for that and failed 3 times. He tried to work it into the Constitution originally and failed. He tried to work it into the Bill of Rights and failed. He tried to get a consensus of opinion on it, namely the federal government's capacity to discipline the state legislatures in their behavior on rights. He failed. So that now, when the Supreme Court acts in this way, on the basis of the 14th Amendment, he would have been very pleased.
I'd like us to go back to the internet. We have another good question.
This is from Indianapolis, Indiana, from Cindy. In the past, it seems like Americans have had principles to fight for and dreams and ideals to preserve. They seemed more patriotic and concerned about the whole of the country rather than just themselves. Can you please comment?
Well, I think Americans out. Sir, would you want to comment?
You go first. I don't want you to do me the way you did Al. You should have run for office with that sort of quickness.
This is hard to say. I think Americans are patriotic now. I think the forms of patriotic expression are more complicated now. Our lives are more complicated than then. And in the 18th century, what I was principally talking about is at the time when everything was fluid and forming, the statement of these principles were rather easier and less complicated to adhere to. I think things are more complicated now. But I don't know quite how you measure a nation's patriotism. But it seems to me that, that Americans are as patriotic now as before. Though, as I say, I don't know how you measure this, sir.
Well, I'll just give you a couple of examples. I agree with you on this. I do think that we are very patriotic if patriotism means loving country and caring about its future more than you care about your immediate self-interest. I think we're still capable of that. And I could give you 2 or 3 examples. I think the enormous response we've had to the idea that we have to save the Social Security system for the 21st century before we go around spending this first surplus we've had in 30 years on tax cuts or spending programs is an example of patriotism. I think the enormous reservoir of interest we've had in this whole issue of climate change and how we can preserve the environment for 21st century America is an example of patriotism, because selfishness is just going ahead and gobbling up whatever is here before us. I think all these young people all over America that are responding to the call to serve in their communities is an example of patriotism. So I think why I'm so glad you're here, I think that it's not because we're not patriotic, but I think a lot of the basic patriotic elements of America, that is the things that make us go, we do tend to take for granted, which is why I think it's so important that we take the occasion of entering a new millennium and a new century to think about the basic things again, so we'll be more sensitive to them. Why do we have a Bill of Rights? Why do we have a government with certain powers to unify us as well as certain limits so that it can't abuse us? What does all this mean? I think that we've been around so long now, and Americans get up every day just expecting the country to work. And so we tend to take for granted what's really best about our country, and I think that can be bad. But I do think that the country is fully capable of patriotic action if patriotism means sacrificing today for something greater tomorrow.
Thank you. Dr. Alicia Rowero, you're here from Prince George's Community College with 5 students, and perhaps maybe you or one of them would like to pose a question.
I think I'd like one of my students to ask the question.
Professor Bailey, do you think that the Founding Fathers would have thought the right to privacy was an inalienable right? And if so, at what point would they have thought it interfered with the common good?
Yeah, the right of privacy, constitutional law, you mean? Yeah. The rights of privacy became formulated in constitutional law in 1965. I don't think it was until the concurring opinions in the Griswold case in 1965, Goldberg's concurring, defined it precisely. They did not think in those terms at all. I mean, this was not something on their agenda at the time. And if you say, why not? It seems to me because the problems that were presented in that case in 1965 had not impinged on their lives. It simply was not part of what they were concerned about principally. If it took that long to develop, that is a more interesting question, it seems to me, because until 1965 is a long time. But as far as I know, it was only then, in that case, that that issue was really formulated in constitutional law. It was referred to before. And then, when people were concerned about defining especially marital privacy, because that's what that case was about, they had nothing to go on but the Ninth Amendment in its unlimited powers. And that's at the point where you get Ninth Amendment jurisprudence developing. Subsequently, it's been referred to many times, but that's so difficult. I don't want to go on too long about this, but that's one of the unspecified, unenumerated powers that they did not think of at the time, but were confident that in the future, people would face these problems and would have to specify and define those rights. It's a very good question. And I must say, it's one of the interesting things. I'm no expert on constitutional law, but it does seem to me it's one of the most interesting episodes in the development of the unenumerated rights in the Constitution.
This is from Lauren in Keene, New Hampshire. There is great speculation about how people will respond on an emotional level to the new millennium. Is there anything we can learn from how Americans anticipated and reacted to the turn of the century in 1900?
No. Mrs. Clinton, would you like to answer that? Not that I know of. Next. Nothing comes to mind on the great concerns about the year 1900, though there must have been some. As to the year 1000, that goes back before my period.
But I'm sure Thomas Bender, Dean of Humanities at NYU, has thought about
Yes,
1900.
Fine, where's he?
I'm afraid I haven't thought as much about 1900 as I should for this occasion, perhaps. I'd like to ask a question, actually pushing back to the 18th century again. One of the things your work very much did for historians was to show how different the 18th century was, that we are so inclined to read back the same thing. I guess I want to, with that as a background, ask a question. I may be slightly misrepresenting the sort of thrust of what you said, but it seemed to run a little bit like that there are these ideals that are sound, and we have fallen, not lived up to them or fallen back. But in the instance you just gave, in the case of privacy, shown how there we expand them. I guess one of the questions that comes to me from that is, do we have to ask about the ideals themselves to get back into that world that was different? Not just that it hadn't anticipated certain technological and other issues of the present, but take something which you dealt with, that is slavery and freedom. Is that a case in the 18th century of falling short of ideals, or did that make sense in a certain way in the 18th century? And then historically, for a number of reasons, that doesn't make sense. Slavery and freedom can't go together any longer as Lincoln's
That
house
was
divided.
the basic, one of the great encounters that I mentioned, was the word I used for that, encounters between the realities of the 18th century, which have been accepted without debate, essentially. There were some before the Revolution who were concerned about that, but not many. After the Revolution, there's never a time when that isn't the main problem in American public life. And it seems to me there's an encounter that people didn't anticipate in this. Many people didn't anticipate that it would make that enormous impact on an institution so deeply rooted. But gradually it did. And eventually it became impossible to sustain the institution against what people had come to believe, as well as the other forces at work in the world. But that's the best example, it seems to me, of unanticipated conflict on the part of many people, not all, but many people, between what had been generated in the reform ideas of the time and the really overwhelming difficulties of social life of the time. But it seems to me exactly what happened. Then gradually you find that being eroded, and finally, but only after the bloodiest conflict in American history, was it finally, of course, eliminated. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Mr. President, did you want to comment on that?
I was just going to say, following up on that, I think you can look at basically all the big turning points in American history, all of them, and say that we survived and sort of went on to a higher level of achievement because two things happened. One, we reaffirmed the Union in new circumstances instead of letting it become weaker and divided, obviously in the Civil War. And secondly, we expanded the meaning of liberty in a new and different time, but in a logical way. And I think if you go back throughout the entire history of the country and you look at every major turning point in history, it was a triumph for the idea of union and for the idea of liberty. And I hope that that will always be the case. But I believe that to be true. I also, we had a cyberspace question here about should we learn anything from 1900? It may just be pure accident, but it's interesting that in 1800, when Thomas Jefferson was elected, when the century changed, we began the movement from being essentially a colonial society to a continental one. In 1900, when William McKinley was reelected, and then Theodore Roosevelt soon thereafter became president when Mr. McKinley was killed, we began to come to terms fully with the implications of the Industrial Revolution on our society. And in 2000, we will be still about the business of fully coming to terms with the implication of the technology and information revolution on our society. So I think you might be able to go back and see how people were dealing with it, what principles were there, whether they're relevant to today. And it might also be interesting to see what some of the predictions were in 1900 that turned out right and what turned out wrong, as a way of adding a grain of salt to whatever all the rest of us are going to be saying in 3 years.
I might also add that the election of 1800, since you mentioned it, was the dirtiest election in American history. But skip that.
I can't believe that we're almost at the end of our satellite time, so maybe we could take the last question again from the internet.
This is from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, from Frank. Most Americans probably don't know what is in the Bill of Rights. So how can we be sure those values endure? And of course, one of the reasons we're having this lecture series is to hopefully spark debate in our country about what we do hold dear and what we do believe in. And so we're hoping that more people will learn about and understand and cherish our founding principles like the Bill of Rights.
Reserves all the unenumerated rights to the people, and the 10th, which reserves all the unenumerated powers to the states. And that was the reserve that the people of the time, concerned about the powers, the national powers they were creating, wanted to state clearly that these were limited powers in the federal government. And the way they finally agreed to do this was precisely in the Bill of Rights, specifying things that the federal government cannot do, and then saying that all the rest beyond those enumerated powers and rights are reserved to the people in the states. It's a way, and if I were to say what is the absolute principle of the Bill of Rights, it is their way at that time, in 1787-8, it was their way of saying that the powers were created are bounded powers. They're not limitless. They're bounded. They're limited in specific ways, and it was a protection of the people and the people through the states that the Bill of Rights were finally enacted. I should say that the Bill of Rights was a redaction by a submission from the states of something like 85 recommendations from the states, redacted by a committee that was led by Madison, who, as I mentioned before, himself originally was against the whole idea.
Mr. President, you get the final words.
Are we done? Well, first of all, let me say to all of those who have followed us and other sites, thank you for joining us. Technology really has turned out to be a wonderful thing. We had 400,000 hits on our website after the State of the Union. So Americans really are tuning in positive ways to the internet. Professor Balin, thank you for reminding us of the things that are profoundly, essentially American, about our nation, about our past, and therefore critical to our future. I want to thank Hillary again and Ellen Lovell for conceiving of this idea and executing it. I want to welcome you all to leave Abigail Adams' washroom here and go down to the estate dining room where we'll all be able to visit for a few moments now, and ask everyone to tune in when in about 3 weeks we have the next one of these. Thank you very much, and good evening.